Gaius Licinius Macer, Praetor 68 BCE, and Roman historian. A man aspiring to found a new branch of gens Licinia, Gaius Licinius Macer came of age during an era of civil war and dictatorship. Eschewing the political orientation of his Licinian relatives, Macer became a popularis. Although he attained the rank of praetor, Macer would fail to reach the summit of politics in Rome. Convicted of extortion, Macer chose to erase his own existence rather than embrace a life in exile. However, he is remembered today for what he left behind, a lost history of Rome. This book contained a few important historical innovations and influenced several subsequent historians, most notably Livy. As we shall see, most of the details of Macer's career and scholarly output may have been lost, but his influence is still discernible in the writings of surviving ancient historians of Rome. One imagines that every plebeian nobleman, that is to say, every plebeian from a family which had produced a consul, saw his own heritage as the most noble in Rome, at least among the plebeians. The descendants of Gaius Licinius Stolo perhaps had the best claim of anyone in Rome. And the reason for this is that their ancestor, Licinius Stolo, alongside of Lucius Sextius, had worked together as colleagues for a number of years and successfully pressured the Senate, which up to then was completely dominated by the patricians, to open up the higher offices to plebeians. Lucius Sextius would hold the honor of being the first ever plebeian consul in 366, but his family would ultimately fall off in prominence. However, the descendants of Gaius Licinius Stolo would be legion, and in fact, he would be the third ever plebeian consul, serving in 364 and then again in 361. After this, there would be a number of major branches of the family which would attain prominence. And as with all of the great gentes, some of those branches would wither and die by the time of the late Republic. Nonetheless, during the late Republic, there were four notable branches that would have been known to anyone who followed politics casually or more seriously. Two of those branches, the Crassi and the Luculii, were very well represented at this time by Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome and a member of the First Triumvirate, and Lucius Licinius Lucullus, who was one of the more prominent generals between the time of Sulla and then the rise of Pompey. There also were other branches of the family, however. The Murani produced consuls at the time, even though these were typically not the most famous consuls, and the Nervi, while they failed to attain the pinnacle of the consulship, did manage to produce praetors fairly consistently in the late Republic. There were also some more minor branches of the family. So there were other cousins of Gaius Licinius Macer who were politically active. As for Licinius Macer, he was born in 108 BCE, and he was the first member of the branch known as Licinii Macri to try to attain political prominence. The name Macer means something like thin or lean, and because he's the first man in his family with that name, there's a good chance that it was a name which owed to this man's physique. We also know that his son was known for being very short, so that would kind of make sense. At any rate, Macer, regardless of his weight, was someone who would have had a lot of military experience. By the time he was in his late teens, Rome was now engaged in a severe conflict called the Social War. Rome's allies revolted, and the Romans had to fight them in Italy for 3 years running. In all likelihood, Macer would have seen action at least 2 of those 3 years, as different young men would be rotated in and out as junior officers in the legions. Right on the heels of that, Sulla was chosen to go fight Mithridates, who had overrun Roman Asia, and then Marius had taken his command through the offices of a tribune. This led to a off-and-on intermittent civil war between Sulla and then Marius, and when Marius died, it was Cinna, and when Cinna died, it was Carbo, and that would drag on until at least late 82, when Sulla and his men won the Battle of Colline Gate. And then after that, there was still more mopping up to do in Italy. And, oh yeah, there was this guy, Quintus Sertorius, off in Spain, who kept the cause alive for several more years. So this was an era of war and hardship, and by the time that he was eligible for office, this means that Macer was most likely someone who had seen quite a bit of action and was more experienced than his youth would make one assume. There was also another factor at play. When Sulla had won the Civil War, one of the things that he had done was to pin all of the blame for the conflict on the Populares faction. He said that they had caused all the problems, and so he decided to put a list of people who needed to be killed, and many of his political opponents were simply executed and their things were confiscated. Some of them, of course, did escape through bribery, but most of the men on the list did indeed die. This means that there was now a vacuum of leadership, and this vacuum would last for about a decade. So throughout the 70s, there were plenty of people in Rome, common people, voters, who were looking for leaders they simply couldn't find because they either didn't exist or they were too young. Think of Caesar. And among the men who rose to prominence with Sulla and then were in a position to succeed after him, we usually think about Pompey, of course, but there were two others who were noteworthy here: Marcus Licinius Crassus and Lucius Licinius Lucullus. And both of these men, who were relatives of Macer, were among the most prominent in Rome during the 70s and 60s. In the case of Crassus, of course, this would last until his death at Carrhae in 53. And so, one could always call upon one's relatives for political support and for money if needed, especially Crassus, who lent money to most people in Rome, especially before Pompey and Caesar became mega wealthy and could lend money themselves. And so, one would think that Macer might take a more conservative tack, since that was not only the prevailing political stance of the time, but also that he had two relatives who were major supporters of Sulla and were very well positioned in that world. And yet, that is not what he did. Instead, he embraced the Populares. What this means is that most likely, if he fought in the Civil War at all, he actually fought against Sulla, and perhaps his relatives were able to get him pardoned, or simply he was too young to be of note or to be worth prescribing. And looking at the field, perhaps he looked at the state of the Populares and he figured, well, someone needs to lead that faction, and why not someone with a name like Licinius, someone with instant name recognition, someone who is a cousin of these other men who are leading the other faction. I can revive this dead party, and I can do so with a little bit of political cover because my relatives will be a little bit hesitant to go after me directly. A very strong piece of evidence that Macer sided with Cinna and Carbo is that he served under them as a triumvir monetalis in 84. This was an office that was particularly advantageous to aspiring senators. Most Romans had to wait until they were at least 28 to 30 years old when they were running for the quaestorship to get their name out there. But anyone who was chosen to be a moneyer, and there doesn't seem to have been a specific age requirement for it, could start to advertise himself early. The Senate would choose 3 young men, almost all of whom were aspiring senators, to operate the public mints and produce coinage. The idea was to produce enough coins to keep the economy liquid. But the good part about this, if you're an aspiring senator, is that the content of the coin, its image, and what's written on it, was fairly open form. A young moneyer could put whatever he wanted on the coin. And so, naturally, each of these ambitious young men would use the opportunity to commemorate and glorify his ancestors, while also putting his name on something that people would use in the marketplace. So, for the otherwise unknown Macer, this was a good chance to let people know that he was a member of the famed Licinius family. And then he could put an image associated with one of his ancestors, achieving something glorious, but reading with his own name underneath. So this was a big deal. After the Civil War, and having survived the proscription, he now decided to seek other offices. A little bit before this, Sulla had first stripped all 10 tribunes of the ability to run for any subsequent office, so the tribuneship became a dead-end office. But then, in 75, that prohibition was lifted. So steadily, even the followers of Sulla saw that this was unsustainable, and there was a lot of pressure to go back to the traditional constitution where the tribunes had veto power and also the ability to pass legislation. So in 75, that prohibition was lifted, and now tribune could be a step, albeit not a required one, on the cursus honorum, the ladder of advancement through the Senate. Macer was tribune in 73, so his career got delayed by a fair amount because he picked the wrong side in the Civil War. Nonetheless, once he was elected tribune, he became known for his populist sympathies, and we don't really know of anything in particular that he did. Most likely, he was looking to restore more powers of the tribunate, since that was one of the big issues in the 70s, and he also did enough to make a young and impressionable Sallust noticed. Sallust, of course, is a future historian of Rome, who would have been probably a teenager at the time, if that, and in his own histories, Sallust notes the actions of Macer, at least in brief. You will also realize that Sallust was a writer of history, just like Macer, and so there's even the possibility that Sallust looked to Macer as a kind of role model, and that's why he happened to know a fair amount about Macer's career. Despite some early turmoil, Macer was on the rise, and he had pretty good prospects when it came to him ultimately attaining the consulship. This was partly because the faction he had chosen to side himself with, the Populares, were making a comeback, slowly but steadily. After 70, when Pompey and Crassus were consuls together, the tribunes recovered most of the powers that had been stripped away from them by Sulla. While no tribune would ever be another Gracchus or Saturninus, this was now once again a powerful office, as Clodius would show the world. But still, not quite what it had been. Nonetheless, it was enough of a power base to enable an actual challenge to the political order in the Senate. As for Gaius Licinius Macer, he was pretty well positioned to become the leader of that group, or he would have been, except that some of the conservative stalwarts, the great stars of Roman politics like Crassus and Pompey, actually started to take a slight popularist tack, as they could sense popular discontent, and in the case of Pompey at least, his great victories had made him generally popular, so he could win votes from voters of all stripes. One other thing that helped Macer's rise was something else in Sulla's reforms that had proved to be more lasting, and that was the expansion of the number of offices. So Sulla had actually increased the number of Praetorian spots to 8, because there were a lot of obligations that the Roman state now had in terms of places it needed to govern. There were 2 slots that were more prestigious than the rest, and those were the 2 slots running the court for lawsuits between Roman citizens and the law court which managed disputes between Roman citizens and non-citizens. And because Macer was not the biggest deal in Roman politics, my supposition is that he did not finish first or second in the election and therefore didn't get either of those slots. Nonetheless, a praetor is a praetor, and another thing that he owed to Sulla's reforms was that it was now customary for every outgoing praetor to govern a province for a year. So, in all likelihood, Macer got a province in 67. Like all Romans who wanted to be consul, this was a chance to line his pockets and prepare himself, perhaps by mounting a military campaign and winning a little bit of glory, coming home with more money than he had started, and going for it within a couple years, trying to reach the pinnacle of Roman politics. Macer was back in Rome by 66. Most likely his grand strategy was to run for office in the summer of 65 and then be sworn in as consul in early 64. He would therefore have achieved his dream. But that was not to be. Like so many other Romans of this era, Macer was accused of extortion. This was not an uncommon charge, although it was a severe one. Corruption, and also being tried for corruption, had become commonplace. A whole lot of officials had to deal with this. Unless you were extraordinarily scrupulous, or you were very good at covering your tracks, this would be something that would befall you if you were an aspiring senior magistrate. There were also instances of people who were innocent who were put on trial and convicted anyway. There were other times when someone who was flagrantly guilty would be acquitted because of bribery. So we don't know the truth about Macer's governorship. And in fact, we don't even know where his governorship was. But what ended up happening is that Macer was indeed convicted. And the penalty for extortion was quite severe. One would be stripped of their rank, so they'd be booted from the Senate completely, and then forced into exile. Their estate would then pass on to their nearest of kin, at least for managing, and they would not be allowed to come back to Rome or even Italy for the remainder of their existence, barring some sort of special recall. At this time, Macer decided that he had seen enough of life. He was now 42 years old, and most of the men his age were either about to become consul or at least get a chance to run for the office, whereas he was being banished from the city he had worked for his entire life. And so he decided to take his own life. And so, thus, Gaius Licinius Macer left this world, and he left his estate to his 16-year-old son. But that's not the whole story, because it turns out that while he was a competitive politician, Gaius Licinius Macer was also active in another arena of activity altogether, and it would be in this arena of activity where he would actually make his mark. Given that Macer elected to end his existence when his political career came to a halt, one has to assume that he was wedded to politics, and that history was merely a mistress. Yet, it would be that mistress who would ensure that Macer's fame continued long after his death. While most of the men in the streets around him would have only known him as Macer the Senator, most likely his contemporaries were quite aware of his intellectual activities. Certainly, within a generation or so after his passing by the time of Sallust, that was more or less the only thing that people remembered about the guy. His own political career was ultimately somewhat humdrum, but his historical writing was far more interesting. His work was a pretty ambitious one, as had a number of historians before him, and as would a few after. He endeavored to write a complete history of Rome from its foundation to the present, or at least to some unknown and unspecified end date, and he wrote 16 total books, or so we're told. I suppose we know so little about his work that we don't know whether he intended to write 16 books, or whether he actually completed 16 books. It would make a bit of a difference, I think. This work has been long lost to us, but we do know some things about it. For instance, we know that it was highly compressed when it came to covering the early history of Rome. A book, for context, is how much can fit on a standard size scroll. So if you were to translate that into English and then write it in a standard size modern book, we're talking somewhere between 30 and 40 pages. So he covered the entire history of Rome down to the time of Pyrrhus of Epirus in just the equivalent of 60 to 80 pages. And that's assuming, of course, that Pyrrhus of Epirus appears at the end of Book 2. We don't know where in Book 2 Pyrrhus of Epirus appears, just that he's there somewhere. So this tells us that his focus was on more contemporary, i.e. better documented events. So he kind of used some telescoping, and his focus was primarily on the present. Interestingly enough, though, as we'll see, a lot of the things that we know about what he said about certain events were things clearly taken from these early 2 books. We also don't know whether he was done with his project or whether he had plans to continue it at the time of his death. So that's another unknown. So now let's talk about the elements of this history that were memorable and impactful. From the standpoint of methodology, it turns out that Macer made one major advancement over all of his predecessors. One of the real problems in writing Roman history is that the early Romans had been rather poor record keepers. There just weren't great archives to go through, and people had traditionally gone to family histories to get details. There was only so far you could go with that. And so one thing that Macer introduced to the practice of writing history was to look more closely at temple records. This was probably something that Fabius Pictor, the first Roman historian, had done to some extent, but Macer would find something new and valuable. And that was the so-called Libri Lenti, or linen books. These are records kept at temples on linen, and they were kept by Romans and Etruscans. We have to imagine, given how deeply the Etruscans influenced the Romans on so many things, that the practice was Etruscan in origin, and the Romans simply copied it. Pretty much everything the Romans had, they copied from either the Etruscans or the Greeks. Anyway, in terms of what these things were for, what was in them, and when these linen records started being kept, we don't really know. However, the scholarly consensus at the moment is that the Romans might have only started keeping these around the 2nd century, which, interestingly enough, was when they started to take a much stronger interest in the recording of history. That most of these records contained information on mythology, or else lists of political and religious officials. So we think that a lot of the information here was somewhat rudimentary. And a lot of what we think about this is influenced by the one surviving example we have, which was this kind of linen being wrapped around an Etruscan mummy. And the linen used for the mummy had a lot of religious information from mythology on it. There's also been speculation that these were simply notes kept by priests for some reason. But at any rate, the scholarly consensus at the moment is at odds with the claim that Macer made, apparently. He cited the linen rolls at the temple of Juno Monida, where he had worked as a moneyer back in 84, and he said that this was one of his major sources. He also claimed that these records went all the way back to the 4th century BCE. If so, it is rather odd that no one before Macer had found this before, or thought to use it, because there were moneyers most years, and all of them worked in the same temple, and others like it. But then we think about it a little more. The fact is that the number of people who were writing history was rather small, and a number of them had been Greek, so they would not have been able to have easy access to these temples. Not only that, but the Romans there, not all of them were historically inclined, and most of them, like Macer, also had an active political life. So, in all likelihood, Macer noticed these records when he was 24 years old working as a moneyer, and he went back and used them later to help him write history. This also means that he was doing a lot of his historical writing most likely when he was in his 20s. And that's not all that odd if we think about it, because most grad students in modern America are 20-something years old. So it all kind of fits. But yes, you would think that something this obvious would have been done a while before. However, when your community of active participants is small, then a lot of obvious things go undone for some time. Macer's biggest contribution to Roman history was undoubtedly finding and implementing linen rolls in Roman history. This was a new source of information as yet untapped, and no doubt it gave the Romans a much clearer portrait of their history. This might also have been the time when they really started to make better use of things like the fasti, and to really establish a firm year-by-year timeline. Now, we already know that by volume, Macer's work was not focused on the early Republic or on the period of the kings. And yet, when later writers would cite Macer's work, they often focused in on those first 2 books. Even though his linen rolls did not stretch back to the time of the kings or even to the dawn of the Republic, still, he made some claims about this era that attracted some attention. The later writer Macrobius says that he controversially claimed that Romulus was responsible for creating intercalary months. Romulus, of course, is the mythical founder of Rome, and an intercalary month is a month added to the lunar calendar to make it align with the seasons. Over time, lunar calendars get out of step with the solar year, and what Roman priests would do is get together and add months of varying lengths in order to make the calendar month and the season align. And so, this was controversial not because it was attributed to Romulus, but rather because the usual go-to mythological figure who was responsible for just about every aspect of Rome's religious culture was Numa Pompilius. And yet, Romulus, who traditionally only made the Romans warlike, was instead held up as the originator of the intercalary month. Livy also has some claims about Macer, mostly detailing Macer's early treatment of Licinius Stolo. And he says that when he cites Macer, he always has to be careful because Macer tends to play up the contributions of the Licinii, including details that he can't locate in other historical writers who came before Macer. So either Macer had access to more information than his predecessors, or, Livy suggests slyly, he may have been inventing a few things. It's possible that the details that Macer added were, in fact, from his family's history. Each family would have a history of the deeds of their ancestors, and so perhaps there was a genuine, albeit heavily biased tradition about what ancestral Licinii had done. Livy also tells us that on a partisan level, Macer tended to be very sympathetic to the populares of the past, and rather critical and hostile to the conservative aristocrats of yore. He also says, somewhat hypocritically, that Macer was an adherent of the rhetorical school of history, which had both Greek and Roman adherents and was fairly common in the Hellenistic period. To give an example of what this means, there were writers like Quintus Curtius Rufus who would moralize and try to wax eloquent while talking about Alexander, whereas a later writer on him was Arrian, who would cite his sources much more precisely. So the more critical style of writing was often called, perhaps somewhat incorrectly, the Thucydidean school, and the other school was called rhetorical. And if anything, Livy tends to be a bit of a blend of both, because he will often add details that he couldn't possibly have known, and offer embellishments for, I guess, what we call patriotic purposes. But at the same time, Livy, as we can see here, clearly does cite sources sometimes. So Livy is a bit of a blend, and he claims that Macer is very much firmly in the rhetorical school, which is interesting given that Macer was such an innovator when it came to finding new sources. The account of Macer's ancestor that Livy has, the account of Licinius Stolo, might have been altered by Macer originally, as it mirrors very closely the life of the Gracchi. So Macer and his colleague are portrayed like the Gracchi brothers of the 130s and 120s BCE. And so either Macer and or Livy, perhaps trying to reconstruct the career of those men and the politics of that time, were very heavily influenced by more recent events and perhaps thought that, to sort of quote George Lucas, of all people, that history rhymed. And so perhaps they were simply filing in information into an existing structure that they thought made sense and that would have been something that the Romans of old would have operated within. Gaius Licinius Macer, in the final analysis, was a political failure. He had just enough things going for him and had played his cards well enough to a certain point to rise to the second highest office in Rome. Had he managed to keep his nose clean and not fall prey to a corruption charge, there's a pretty good chance that he would have become a consul. But that was not to be. Perhaps he had made too many enemies with his populist politics. Nonetheless, his history, which reflected his populist values, would survive, and it would be known for a long time by a wide variety of later authors. We know that the historians Sallust, Livy, Dionysius of Halicarnassus, and Valerius Maximus were all aware of this work and put it to use. Even Macrobius, who lived around the year 400 CE, had access to the work as well. So this meant that until about the 5th century, at the earliest, this work was still extant and in the libraries of Roman aristocrats. Ultimately, Livy, and to a lesser extent Dionysius of Halicarnassus, would supplant Macer's work in terms of it being a major history of Rome, but Macer's work continued to be circulated, even if it had been surpassed in scope and in eloquence. In the process of building upon what Macer did to create something better, they did manage to preserve some of his claims. We know, for instance, about Licinius Stolo because of Livy's account. Livy himself is aware that there's probably a lot of bias in the way that it's presented, but he doesn't really have an alternative. After all, Macer was preserving the gens Licinia version of events, and that was probably the only version of events that they had to work with at the time. So what was he to do? Another legacy of Macer was the fact that he actually did succeed in very temporarily founding a new branch of gens Licinia. Despite the fact that he died in disgrace, he did leave a son behind, Gaius Licinius Macer Calvus. His son was only 16 when Macer took his own life, and he went on to be relatively famous in his own right. Macer Calvus was a member of the literary circle of Catullus, the great poet. He also wrote poetry, and he was a respected young orator in the forensic law courts. Cicero thought that his style was boring, since Macer Calvus kind of used the Attic style, which was all about being reserved and kind of like the Olympian reserve of Pericles, whereas Cicero was a little bit more over the top and aggressive. And yet, nonetheless, Cicero did respect the ability of Macer Calvus and praised his skill in court. However, Macer Calvus would not live to see old age. In fact, he also would die at a young age, around 47 or 46 BCE. So far as we know, he had no heirs, and with him perished the Licinii Macri line. It was a short run for the line, but at least both members of it were creative and intelligent men who made a pretty positive impression for the most part on their contemporaries, and were willing and able to take intellectual risk. So, that's something. And the fact that any account we read by a surviving ancient historian was influenced at least in some small way by Gaius Licinius Macer means that he actually did have an impact on Roman history, even if it was not quite joining the Fausti of consuls. Until next time, I'm Thersites the Historian.